Another thing that struck me that was really interesting, I'm wondering if we can think about, one of the big, we call it the elephant in the room, is of course Europe, and Marshall brought alive this idea too, this triangulation about these artists in the Americas, many of whom are of course responding off to European artists. But one of the things at the same time that struck me is that there's this, in what a number of your talks brought about, is this beautiful freedom too, this liberation that artists seem to take, to move away and to move beyond what some of the artists in Europe had done. And I just thought maybe you guys could talk about some of that. I mean, be it in the terms of the medium or, with especially the role of printmaking, for example, which is just so interesting and really pushing the boundaries of that to carve plaster and things of that nature.
I think one of the difficulties in that question is our tendency to think of these sort of monumental blocks, and the first of them being that to talk about Europe as one place, it's like talk about Latin America as one place. It has the same problem. That within Europe there's as complex a dynamic between, just to give an example, between Russia and the United Kingdom, for example, where there are related sort of phenomena of dialogue and effects, and all these same issues we've been speaking about here today also happen on the European stage. As you might say, they happen on the American stage on between the different coasts or the different regions. So I think that there's a sense of there being, in a sense, a kind of continuum rather than this sort of block-to-block relationship. Also because so many of these artists did have a fluid relationship with Europe, either from their own family histories, or they traveled back and forth, or they were coming and going. So I think that there's in a way, what that question leads to is an even broader framework. This exhibition has already broken like one of the big taboos of the North and South America, but in a sense what we should really be talking about is the whole thing. And then that question of region within a cultural area becomes really interesting and very rich.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that at this point, I've thought a bit about, why to bring North and South together specifically, and part of it, one of the things, or one of the goals with Constructive Spirit is, of course, to bring attention to a number of artists that haven't really even been given much consideration, and especially today, like I'm sure John Ferren, Biederman, and others, these are some new artists, I think, for many people to learn about it, and it almost seems like we need to, explore that, but also just sort of shifting, focus, I think was really key. But I agree with Gabriel. I think ultimately the next step is to, it's a worldwide phenomenon, of course, and, the dialogue, I think, can be pushed much further, it's a much broader dialogues, absolutely. We also want to make sure that you, the audience, also has a chance to comment and to engage in the dialogue. So we have a microphone. So if you raise your hand, I'll just point out, and then if you could please speak into the microphone so that we get your audio, okay?
Sure. I just wanted to respond to Ms. Larson's comment about the legacy of geometric abstractions. I was a young art student in Washington, D.C. in 1967 and walked into the Corcoran Museum and had my head blown off by Tony Smith's sculpture Smoke and Ronnie Bladen's giant X. It's still with me. I'm still painting, and and Tony Smith's sculpture X, I saw it now in the L.A. Museum. The Japanese built it in steel. It was plywood back then. But and I see there's a panel discussion here on the same thing. So, yeah. So it's alive and well, and we are continuing. Believe me, it's been a wonderful day.
Well, one of the things I think a lot of these artists share is that they had long and productive and deeply thoughtful careers. Most of them were thinkers and lifelong learners, but they weren't the most famous artists of their time, and they didn't participate in the notion of branding your style and then sort of leaving it static. Because I remember when he had his show at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in 1936 in New York, Biederman was told by the gallery proprietor that now your style has to stay the same because you have a brand. And he said, "You're out of your mind. You know, I'm just starting."
He told Ferren the same thing, or pretty close.
You know, and these people seem to me, all of them, emotionally and intellectually liberated to go where they wanted to go and do what they wanted to do. And yes, they weren't, you know, the head titled artists of the time, but they were great contributors, and we're just finding out how much.
Okay, very dangerous looking enterprise. Yeah, just to agree with that. Pape was definitely of that character that, I mean, she spoke in interviews in the last part of her life that she resisted sort of market pressures and described herself as intrinsically anarchistic was the way she, and I think, you know, her work is much more difficult to map than an artist like Oiticica or Clark, where there's continuity of issues that they pursue throughout their life, whereas Pape stops making art at a certain point and makes films and does graphic design, and then when she comes back to her art, relating it to her earlier work, you have to sort of go through these odd connections, like I pointed out, that she traces. So that I think has had a huge effect on her sort of status. Although she was really one of the premier artists of her time in the 50s, she hasn't received the attention that Clark and Oiticica have recently.
Well, and I mean, that's one of the beauties of this exhibition and this symposium, is it's a chance to you know, introduce these artists to the canon, I think. And, you know, I mean, canon revision isn't something that happens overnight, right? I mean, it takes time. So it's just a wonderful opportunity to move toward that, I think.
One of the things that I think is an interesting difference, or that struck me today about the perhaps the north-south difference, perhaps not, is the importance of the groups, particularly in the southern cone, that it's almost the opposite phenomenon happens, at least in Argentina, where you get these groups of maybe as many as 20 different artists, of who 2 or 3 then continue. A lot of them actually stopped being artists or became much less interesting artists afterwards. The case of Juan Melé is a great example, where, you know, these works are right there, but then the rest of the career is not so interesting. And various people are banding art making altogether. Tomás Maldonado moves into design and then into philosophy. So it's, I wonder why it is that these artists, why it is that they come together, and they come together in a particular way. And sometimes they're very loose associations that just seem to be kind of support mechanisms, like membership groups. But sometimes the sense of the group is really determining. Certainly in the case of Torres Garcia in Uruguay, certainly in the case of the Argentines, certainly in the case of the concrete and the neo-concrete artists, it's more than just a convenience. It's a way of identifying and of sort of taking art. That consequence of art being a weapon is to then kind of get an army together and have the army fight. But there seems to be a little bit less of that. I don't know whether it's just because of the artists we were looking at today, or whether that's just a phenomenon of difference.
Yeah, just briefly, I think that also there's a big difference between the very structured development of institutions in the United States after the war, with the schools like overflow, you know, art schools, and the professionalization of the field, which obviously didn't happen as such in South America. So that it's roughly something to think about. You know, this institutional, the state of institutions in both museums, galleries, obviously all of that, and the group maybe replacing that vacuum.